Thank you very much, Dr. Calkins. Don't disappear just yet, because you'll join us now for our second panel. So she was able to queue up for us PFAS assessment and monitoring from a scientific perspective. So getting a little bit better interest and insight into what these forever chemicals are. So now let's talk about it. We have a session called Overexposed, the PFAS Epidemic among Firefighters. And I'd like to invite to the stage a couple of folks to engage in this particular discussion. First is Dr. Danny Wu, who is the Chief Medical Officer of the International Association of Firefighters. He had a distinguished 30-year career as a professional firefighter and EMS paramedic, serving in Miami-Dade County as a Division Chief for Fire, Rescue, and EMS Operations, Assistant Director of the Office of Emergency Management, and the Deputy Incident Commander of the Emergency Operations Center. Also joining him on the stage is General President-elect Edward A. Kelly. Mr. Kelly was elected the IAFF's 10th General President as the IFF's 55th convention in March of 2021. He joined the Boston Fire Department, go Boston, from there, as a firefighter EMT in 1997, where he was assigned to Ladder Company 17 in Boston's South End and was among the thousands of firefighters at Ground Zero after the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks on the World Trade Center and responded to the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. He rapidly climbed the ranks of organized labor and is known and respected for his strong dedication to the rank and file members of the IFF and his visionary leadership across labor and management. Also on the stage is joining us attorney Robert Bilott. Robert is an American environmental attorney from Cincinnati, Ohio. Bilott is known for the lawsuits against DuPont on behalf of plaintiffs injured by waste dumped in rural communities in West Virginia. Mr. Bilott has spent more than 20 years litigating hazardous dumping of the chemicals perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, and perfluorooctanoic sulfonic acid, PFOS. So join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Doc, thanks for having us.
So we wanted to have a couple of conversation about PFAS. You may know one or two things about it, I understand. So some of the questions that we wanted to before we get to these questions is part of our programming these next 2 days is to take a look at the new documentary that has come out, Burned, Protecting the Protectors. We're going to be showing that tomorrow as part of this program during the lunch hour, and you're all invited. It's 30 minutes to watch this really impactful documentary on the impact of this. In fact, we're going to just show you a really quick trailer about the documentary.
I loved being a firefighter. There's something about flying down the road, in a fire truck that kids dream of. I had 3 or 4 years to go to retirement. A week later, I was at home and I got a phone call from my doctor.
So I automatically thought, oh, well, this is going to be fine. Nothing's going to be wrong here at all. Phew, we dodged this one. All of a sudden, the doctor says, yep, it's cancer. I just had to find out why.
Here's the spouse of a firefighter who writes me and says she thinks PFAS is being used in their gear. And it's the first I'd heard of it. Can you send me a sample of the gear? I'd be happy to test it.
And I have 44 names so far on my list. Brother firefighters, diagnosed with cancer, wondering what to do next.
I was horrified when, slightly more than a month into the research, he called us and said, we need to stop the study. We need to tell firefighters.
I had a fire wife on social media pleading for someone to listen to her. That was Diane Carter.
She was right. There is no reason we should have carcinogens in our personal protective equipment. It defies logic.
Got an opportunity to watch this tomorrow during our lunch hour for 30 minutes. So let's queue up a conversation about PFAS in the fire service. So for any of our panelists, this is an open question. If you all would not mind, and Miriam, please feel free to join in as well. I know you're joining us virtually for this. You mentioned a little bit earlier, and I'll direct this one actually to Miriam first, about the different point sources where firefighters come into contact with PFAS. What do you think, either Miriam or to our panel, are some of the major concerns that firefighters may have around exposure?
Well, I certainly can't speak to the actual lived experience and what those concerns would be. Everyone's concerns are going to be motivated by different factors and their own experiences. But looking at it from an exposure scientist perspective and looking at the different routes, I think the data clearly shows that the use of AFFF increases the potential exposure. So certainly trying to do whatever can be done to either reduce the use of AFFF, how it's used, where it's used. I know there's been a lot of work to try to change practices, including how it's stored, how it's tested, the frequency of testing the systems, for example. Does it have to be done weekly? Can it be done monthly or quarterly? Can it be done in an enclosed system? And so can we not train with it? Can we use something else instead? So things like that, those little changes, I think is something that as an individual, I would be really in tune with my department and with the training institution that I'm going to if I'm going somewhere else to do my training. Similarly, the gear has certainly come up as a topic of discussion. I am not an expert on the textile materials. I know there are probably people in the room who have more information. So I would encourage you to seek them out if they're there. And I know that there's a lot of work being done right now by other members of our NIOSH community as well as NIST. And so those reports, there was one released last spring that describes what's actually in the gear itself. And then there's another one that should be coming out shortly, if it hasn't been released already, that's looking at how various conditions such as abrasion or heat or washing will affect what we're able to measure in the gear. Mm-hmm. So I would be really interested in looking at that and trying to figure out in the absence of new gear or gear that's not available, since gear is very expensive. So your department, even if there's gear available, may not be able to afford it. What are the steps that I can do or I can take to try to reduce my individual exposure? So can I find a surrogate so that I can be doing my PT and exercising and simulating the environment and the conditions I'll be in when I am responding to a fire, but not actually wearing my gear? Is there gear that has less fluorochemicals in it? Maybe it's older gear, maybe it's gear that doesn't have a DWR added to it, that we can use when we're going into schools and talking to children, since it's been noted that putting on that gear, you have that hero sign, right? And the kids get excited, and on a fire safety and education perspective, that can be really important. But you also don't expose yourself when it's unnecessary. So really viewing the gear as PPE. There's the third one that I'll mention right now that we have some information about is how your environment around you, specifically at the fire station, may be affecting your exposure. Yeah. And some of this data is not published. Some of it's not, fully reviewed. So it's not something I can point to a study. But we do know that PFAS get into the environment. They get into plant materials, get into animal materials. And so being very careful with your home garden or your station garden, if that's something you're doing, being very aware if there is contamination, that you want to be cautious of what you're eating that's coming out of that contaminated environment, since we know that there's been reports, for example, of chicken eggs that maybe have PFAS in them, things like that. So just trying to be in tune with your environment and reducing your exposure from wherever you can. Those are probably the top three, but there's certainly others, and I don't want to speak for anyone's exposure or concerns. If someone has very different experiences than what I just summarized, then that's a very valid way to feel. And as a scientist who's not a firefighter, I'm certainly not here to tell anyone that their concerns are not valid. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. To any of our other panelists, would you like to?
Yes, so first of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you. I know that I speak on for GP Kelly and the nearly 350,000 firefighters, that people like you, Erin Kovitz, you, Natasha, and your great team assist year after year since this endeavor started. So I just want to start by thanking you. Phenomenal symposium as always. On the topic of exposure, when it comes to firefighters specifically, we have a different route of exposure that exceeds that of the normal population. So whereas in the normal population, it's usually by ingestion and to a certain extent, inhalation. In firefighters, there is a transdermal exposure that occurs that is significantly greater than that of ingestion and inhalation because of the SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus, and the other cardiorespiratory protections that we have. So transdermal exposure becomes our main exposure source. So Dr. Calkins did a great job in her presentation, and I didn't get to see all of it, so if I repeat myself, please forgive me. But she did a phenomenal job elucidating how important knowing the toxicity of PFAS is. You know, there are some people that say it's not as toxic, industry-based, for you guys to decide when you read the manuscripts, but we at the IAFF rely on independent, not-for-hire researchers, and I'm mentioning the researchers that are here. So when it comes to textiles, we now know that PFAS are being liberally applied to our bunker gear. And the question is why? The question becomes, why is it that we need to be exposed to an unnecessary carcinogen, known carcinogen, in the daily carrying out of our duties? I say no carcinogen because I was invited by IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, to be one of the scientist observers last November. And there, monograph 135 was developed and finalized, in which reclassified PFOA as a group 1 from a 2B. So 2B is possibly carcinogenic. 1 is a known carcinogen to human. So world-renowned researchers get together for 11 days in France at the culmination of their year-long meta-analysis review, and they go, you know what? PFOA is a known carcinogen to humans, and PFAS, its cousin, which had never been evaluated, becomes immediately a 2B, possibly carcinogenic to humans. That should give us pause. Not only should give us pause, but it should make us question whenever it is we see, read, attend talks and presentations that really want to minimize the risk of PFAS. When I sit in presentations where sometimes, unfortunately, firefighters are saying PFAS are not toxic, it just makes me scratch my head. So it's important for you guys, and I applaud all of you guys for being here, but it's important for you guys to realize how toxic these things are, and it's just not me, Dan Wu, speaking here. Go Google IARC monograph 135. I was there. It specifically mentions firefighting there. Monograph 132 in June of 2022 declare the very profession of firefighting as a group 1 known human carcinogen. PFAS contributes to it. And for anybody that wants to tell me otherwise, I will say this to you. Let me put bunker gear on your kids to take a picture and see if you'll take me up on it. I will never look at my kids' pictures in bunker gear the same way again. It makes me sick that I have a ton of pictures of my 4 kids in bunker gear, knowing today what I should have known back then, but industry chose to hide from us.
I'd like to echo and pick up on your last comment here. You know, we listen to this, and we're all here sitting in a room talking about these materials that we've been using for decades. And we now know confirmed carcinogens, that this stuff has been used in these products, used in firefighting foam, and these different treatments for years and years and years. How did we get here? And I think it's important to keep in mind, this has been a lengthy battle to get this information out to firefighters, to the rest of the world here. I mean, these are chemicals that were invented right around the time of World War II that went out into these materials decades ago. And the companies that manufactured those chemicals understood how dangerous, toxic, biopersistent, and carcinogenic these chemicals were decades ago, but push them out into these products, not telling folks, all right, that these things were there, that they were in the foam, that they might be used in these materials coating turnout gear. It took decades of people going into courts to get access to these documents, to finally get this information turned over, not just to the courts, but to get the information to the scientific community, to regulators, to people at NIOSH and the EPA and other agencies that hadn't seen this information. This had been withheld and covered up for decades. And it took way too long for that information to get out. And what we heard about today is all the different ways you can be exposed, particularly firefighters, from these different materials, from the foam, from the gear, from your water, from the dust, from food, etc. And what we now know, though, is ultimately, where does that end up? In our blood, all right? In your blood. And the big question then becomes, what's the significance of that? All right, we know that there's these different places of exposure. We can measure these different places of exposure. What does it do to people? And that's been the big fight. That's been one of the areas where there's been aggressive attempts to cover up that science and that information for a long time. I mean, we had some of the very first cancer studies on PFOA, one of these chemicals, back in the 1980s, showing that PFOA caused testicular tumors in the 1980s. And the companies making this stuff knew that and even internally classified the chemical as a confirmed animal carcinogen in the 80s. You know, and here we are talking about what's just now happening with IARC, who's just getting access to all of this information and all these studies. This was known by the companies making this stuff a long time ago, all right? And even when we were trying to get this information out to the world, it was met with, no, that's you're misleading, there's not enough information, the science isn't clear yet. And so even though we were seeing lots and lots of animal studies showing these cancers many decades ago, human workers working with these chemicals that were showing increased rates of kidney cancers and other cancers back in the 80s and 90s, we kept being told, well, it's not good enough. There's not enough data. There's not enough science. So massive studies were done. 70,000 people living along the Ohio River who had been drinking PFOA were able to get information, get their blood data to scientists that spent 7 years conducting some of the biggest, most comprehensive human epidemiology studies ever done. But it focused on one of these chemicals, PFOA. And at the end, that independent scientists were able to look at all that data and say, yes, this chemical does in fact capable of causing cancer. Testicular cancer, the same thing that was seen in the 1980s, and kidney cancer, and other diseases, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, high cholesterol. Yet still, that was met with pushback. Oh, that's misleading. There's not enough information about that. When we were finally able to get that science out to the rest of the world, that's when we started to finally see regulations start to be developed, laws start to be changed. And in fact, it was a couple years later, I get a call from a firefighter's wife, Diane Cotter, saying, hey, that chemical, PFOA, that was studied down there along the Ohio River, but people had in their drinking water, is that the stuff that's being used on this turnout gear? How do we get studies to see what's happening here? Reached out to ATSDR, the CDC, our federal agencies. This is back in 2017, saying we need to do nationwide studies to see what's happening to firefighters. But a lot of this comes down to funding, all right? Particularly when you're looking at cancers. As I think we all know, it typically requires thousands, if not tens of thousands of people to get a big enough study to draw statistically significant conclusions about whether these chemicals cause cancer. We were able to do that with PFOA, with that community. But then trying to get this done on a national basis, incredibly expensive, tens of millions of dollars to do those studies. ATSDR, CDC announced they're going to try to do those studies looking at different cities across the country. but only people that drank water, not firefighters, not for the occupational exposure. And the concern being that we can't do a big enough study. We don't have enough funds necessary to even look at the cancers. So once again, we try to go into courts to try to say, hey, we should require the companies making these chemicals to fund these studies, to do big enough studies so that can tell us exactly. We know what PFOA does, and we've seen these studies that show these links with cancer with PFOA. What about these other chemicals like PFOS and related? You saw the list. There could be thousands of these. How can we get big enough studies and funding to do that? Being fought in the courts to stop that, to not require those studies and testing to be done. So, I mean, it's incredibly important that we understand what's been going on here. This has been a huge fight to get this information out, to understand, first of all, that these chemicals exist and how many of them. It's not just PFOA, it's PFOS, it's these related chemicals, this entire family of chemicals. And how do we get the studies done, the big enough studies done, like we did with PFOA, that we can confirm these cancers and make sure that steps are taken to protect people. So I'm happy to be here. I know I've talked a little long here, but I'm happy to be here and help make sure that this information gets out to people and that we find ways to get the funding and to get the work done that we need to have done to confirm what we're seeing in these animal studies and these other studies.
Thank you,
That
Mr.
there's a real problem with these chemicals.
Thank you so much.
Real quick, because
Yeah,
I know you
sure.
want to move to your next question. Rob deserves a ton of credit for accomplishing how far we have come in this battle.
Yeah.
As does Diane Carter, that you will see in the film tomorrow, as does Elijah Yetta, that produced that film, the documentary filmmaker, who actually, is he speaking?
Tomorrow.
That's great. Have him tell you about trying to market that and how no one wants to touch anything questioning corporate America in a documentary style. And I'm waiting for a text Mac. Rob talked about testicular cancer, which, Doc, correct me, is usually something that males are diagnosed with in their 20s-ish, right? It's a younger diagnosis cancer. In Massachusetts, our state union, the Professional Firefighters in Massachusetts, has a 16-member executive board. I want to see if he texted me back or not. Not yet. 3 out of those 16 have been diagnosed with testicular cancer since I filmed that video for Burned. I'm not a scientist. Take that for what it's worth.
So,
May I add?
yeah, go ahead, Dr. Calkins.
Okay, I think all the comments that everyone just had were fantastic. I just want to add a little bit to it, which is that in the IARC meeting in 135, referring to PFOA and PFOS, and Dr. We did a great job summarizing everything that came out of that. But one of the main drivers actually for both classifications was the mechanistic data. So it wasn't even just looking at epidemiologic studies or the laboratory animal studies. In fact, the EPID wasn't one of the main drivers for the classification of PFOA. There wasn't quite enough data there yet, even with those studies that Rob mentioned. We really made that decision based on the mechanistic data that was available. So actually understanding how cancer is potentially going to result from the exposure and what's going on with genotoxicity or with epigenetic changes and things like that. So I hope that that's like a little bit of a hope or a little bit of a silver lining or a light at the end of the tunnel, because it means that we can do these studies and affect change prior to the development of cancer and prior to that diagnosis of cancer in an individual. We don't have to wait the 10, 20 years. We can actually start looking at the other parts of PFAS exposure that are happening now and hopefully get that data to, to make these determinations prior to too many more cancers. So.
Yeah, absolutely, Nan. Thank you. So we have a very much international audience that's with us today, watching across the world and here in the U.S. Would you be able to explain how widespread is the use of PFAS firefighting turnout gear, PFAS and firefighter turnout gear here in the United States within our fire departments?
Sure. Do you want me to take a shot at that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So all of our bunker gear, will come to find out, you'll see it in the film tomorrow, there was a study done by Dr. Graham Peasley at Notre Dame University that I remember where I was standing when Kathy Crosby Bell called me, who runs the Last Call Foundation, what actually funded this study. And the doctor had originally told her that it would probably take, I want to say, you'll see it in the film, I want to say he told her, give me 18 months. And then called her about 6 weeks later and said, I don't need 18 months, this stuff is loaded with PFAS. And it became the determining factor of confirming that we have a large quantity of PFAS in the average set of brand new, out-of-the-box bunker gear. And the machination for that is the NFPA standard, which calls for the introduction of this PFAS in order for the inner layer, the moisture barrier between the outer shell and the inner layer, to pass a ultraviolet light test. And the only, what I understand to be the only material that could pass that ultraviolet light test at that time was PFAS, hence the introduction of PFAS. And we came to find out that over the course of time, it was introduced in different layers as well, and found in all different layers. And then we came to learn that as it breaks down, it becomes airborne, and it makes its way throughout the apparatus that we ride in, throughout the firehouse that we live in. It gets on our skin, it absorbs in our skin, we inhale it, we ingest it. I've come to learn that it's more like the tattoos we got when we were kids. You can't just wash it off. It has to be the foliation of your skin to actually remove it. And all I know is that we can do better than that we deserve better than that. And I'll go deeper on where I think on tactically, and do we need a $4,000 or $5,000 set of bunker gear? I think not. I think we need to have next generation gear that, at the end of the day, that gear is not going to withstand a flashover. Give you about 10 seconds. Maybe the gear will last a little longer, but the mask a lot less. Bottom line, we can't withstand a flashover. And we've engineered this gear over the course of generations with, I would argue, in many cases, the best of intentions. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure it makes us safer. I actually would argue that it puts us in places we don't belong. And when you look at the past 2 weeks where we've had terrible fires, where we lost a volunteer firefighter in Virginia in a gas investigation that the house exploded and obliterated, and we had firefighters that were in the middle of it in the basement, and they sustained burns, second-degree burns. We had the explosion of a gas, I think it was a CNG fueled truck in LA, which, miracle, we didn't lose 9 guys, where one firefighter was blown, they have it on video, it's tough to watch, across the street, but they were engulfed in a flame. And ultimately, burns weren't really. I have video of my father in the 80s getting blown across the street in a fireball that was 8 stories high. He wasn't burned. There were flashes. It's when we get caught in a flashover that we burn to death. And the reality is, if we get caught in a flashover with a $5,000 set of gear or a Carhartt suit, the end result is more likely than not going to be the same, sadly. And the goal of a firefighter is to not get caught in that. And I think where we have this highly engineered gear trying to achieve the ability to withstand it versus tactical, practical application of firefighting, we have a disconnect. And I use this line and people hate it, but it's better to be burnt a little than burnt a lot. And as someone who comes from a department where we didn't wear hoods, and we went to fires every day, and we didn't wear pants for 10 years, and the sky didn't fall. They didn't wear bunker gear for a whole long time in this country and beyond in firefighting. And their tactics is what protected them. And at the end of the day, the savability, we shouldn't be dying to save a building. And the savability of somebody who's in a immediately pre-flashover place is probably very, very nil. And we're more likely than not are going to get ourselves killed by having over-engineered PPE that puts us in places we don't belong when there's no one there to save. that's the conversation that we have to have about what the next generation of bunker gear and PPE looks like.
Yeah, and to build off of what General President Kelly was saying, the study that was evaluating PFAS in bunker gear was stopped early because PFAS was so prevalently found in that ensemble. So, like General President Kelly said, right off the shelf, there will be a Group 1 IARC known human carcinogen that has been applied to bunker gear to the tune of, there is a study out there that says, when you take it in relation to the whole ensemble that a firefighter weighs, including SCBA protection and boots and gloves, it's a pound. So a pound doesn't sound like much when you talk about a weight. But let me put it in context for you when it comes to PFAS. The EPA in 2022 called for water standards for PFOA of 0.004 parts per trillion with a T, and for PFAS for 0.002. To put it into context, I had to look it up because I didn't understand what a trillion was. So what I found in Google was, if you consider the whole size of the world as a trillion, as a whole, 1 part per trillion would be 1 speck of dust. EPA is calling for fractions to the tune of 1,000s and 100s for it to be safe. Not only that, the next year, 2023, EPA is actually recommending that those levels for PFOA and PFAS and for a half a dozen other ones that they're recommending against be made an actual 0. 0. That tells you how toxic this thing is. So knowing now 1 pound of PFAS in our bunker gear becomes troublesome. So, especially when you consider the fact that about 50% of it is going to migrate off of the ensemble during the lifetime of the gear. The UV light test, like General President Kelly was saying, test ultraviolet light on a layer of bunker gear that will never see ultraviolet light. And at the current standard, only PFAS, the application of PFAS, allows that moisture barrier to pass it. So we need PFAS in bunker gear, otherwise all of us are going to die. You just heard General President Kelly. No, we're not. Are you reading on the news that firefighters in Europe that are not using PFAS in their outer shells and in some of their ensembles are dying? No. So the narrative of PFAS has to stay here because otherwise we're all going to burn to death is not being pushed by the people that are running into the burning buildings. We need to keep in mind the fact that this is a very profitable endeavor, and whenever I read a piece, I immediately go to the authors and I try to vet them. I rely on independent scientists, and I tend to dismiss those quasi and pseudo-scientists that are paid for and hired for by industry. At the NFPA, you can have different types of memberships. The National Fire Protection Association, a standard 1971 for firefighter ensemble. You can have different type of membership. Well, you can have some members there that are from industry that I would understand I have to argue with because they work for industry. I don't work for them. I work for 350,000 firefighters. So I understand that. Their charge is different. What I don't understand is when there is a firefighter there or firefighters there that are members of the committee advocating for the continued use of a known human carcinogen. In the interest of saving firefighters from burning to death, under that argument, I propose the following. Let's go back to asbestos suits. Asbestos fibers simply do not burn. It is the perfect fire suit. Why did the race car industry and the firefighter industry got away from it? because we found out it's carcinogenic. Now we're being faced with the very same knowledge with PFAS, and there are firefighters out there continuing to promote its use. Like I said before, it makes me scratch my head.
GP Kelly?
Just real quick, I wanted to just pick up where Dr. Wu mentioned that, you don't read about firefighters in Europe who have cut PFAS out of their production, burning to death. I'll tell you where you do read about firefighters dying. A couple hours ago, when we opened up the executive board meeting about a mile and a half from here, we always remember the line of duty deaths we've had since our last meeting, which was December. It was only a couple of months ago. We've had 18 line of duty deaths, and when I read their names 12 of the 18 were cancer. That's the number we got to look at. That's the number that jumps out. And when I came on the job, and I know Commissioner Finn is here, my old fire commissioner in Boston, who was a champion, leading the way in battling firefighter cancer. When I came on the job in '97, the #1 killer of firefighters was cardiac-related disease. It's not even close now. We went to bunker gear in Boston in '94. A lot of places went in probably the '80s, maybe even late '70s. That sound right, Vic? So the mass change in all the major cities was probably closer to the '80s. So if you look at the latency periods where these PFAS getting into our blood and through our skin, inhaling, et cetera, the maturation of cancer there's a lot of strong correlation there. Is the science perfect? Probably not. Probably hasn't really been looked at too hard. But the anecdotal data is pretty loud. And bottom line, what's the end game? Like, what drives the need? And the answer is because it helps protect us from a flashover. And I can tell you, yes, we will get caught in flashovers. Yes, we will die. It's an unfortunate part of what we do. But we are far more likely to die from a multitude of other things. And I almost equate getting caught in a flash. I almost equate a firefighter burning to death to stepping into the ocean and being bit by a shark. You're far more likely to drown. There's a lot more that's going to go on that's going to drive those firefighter fatalities. And I can tell you out of the 18 that I read in, we had one behavioral health, we had cardiac events, we had medicals, we had, we recognized our brother who was a volunteer that died in Loudoun County, that was killed in an explosion. We didn't have anyone, since the last meeting, we may very well have a multitude before the next meeting coming up. But this one, the last 2 months, we never been burned to death. But 18 firefighters sacrificed their lives because of their duty. And that's where we need to kind of make sure that our priority list, we're looking at what's killing us.
Last and final question. So in this room, there's a lot of scientists that are interested in supporting our firefighters and protecting them from PFAS, either from a legal perspective, from a union perspective, or from a scientific perspective. What can we do as scientists to support you in addressing PFAS in the fire service?
I'm going last on that one.
Okay.
So to you and to your like-minded colleagues, we don't have to say anything except thank you. Because
You stole my line. Yeah, I'm going to go it all.
Sorry.
He stole your thunder.
Sorry. You know the fight, and your heart's in the right place, and your paycheck is not being signed by somebody that steers your findings. So to you and your colleagues, again, we say thank you, keep up the fight. We need you, you know. We're firefighters. We sign up to become firefighters. If you don't have a life, or your wife wants to kick you out of the house, she says, go to medical school. But that's how this firefighter ended up being a doctor. But not all of us choose that, or not all of us have a very motivating wife. Nevertheless, I can speak science speak because I chose to learn it. The rest of the nearly 350,000 firefighters need you. And we need you because when I set foot in a courtroom being deposed or being cross-examined, I get crossed on, well, look at this study, and look at that study, and look at this study. They all say that PFAS is not toxic. And then it's my job to dissect it, and I can't do that unless I have mounting evidence provided by the likes of all your researchers here and Dr. Calkins online. So,
Absolutely. I would echo that because I can tell you, this is going to play out in the courts. It's playing out right now. There are thousands of cases pending for firefighters all over the world right now. You may have heard about big settlements recently for drinking water providers, all right? And now the courts are shifting over to focus on these injury claims. And if you think about it, these chemicals, as we heard, where do they end up? They end up in our blood. But they're man-made. They don't exist in nature. So when we find them there, they're sort of fingerprints back to a couple of companies out there that are facing all of these claims. So, think about the potential liability they're looking at, all right? So there's a lot of incentive to fight very hard on the science. And that's been going on for decades, and it's likely to continue. And we're going to hear, we're hearing it already, these arguments about, well, there's, these studies, that was all on PFOA, what about PFOS, and you've got these, not a big enough group here, we need the scientists to continue to do the research on these additional PFAS chemicals, showing what we're, showing these health effects, helping us be able to confirm that in the courts. And as you heard from Dr. Wu and others, there's a lot of stuff that's out there being generated by folks that are getting paid to say there's not a problem here. And so we're going to have to help the courts sort of filter through all of that to understand where's the real science versus what's been bought and paid for. So that's going to be a battle. It's starting already, and it's going to continue for quite some time.
And some of those paychecks aren't real paychecks, just a steak dinner or a trip or whatever, And I'll just say this, society decided a long time ago that when people need help, somebody got to come. And that's the genesis for firefighters. Doesn't matter what it is. House is on fire, check that box. Hurricane so-and-so comes ashore, peekaboo, here we are, 4 minutes later after the call comes in. Whoever's in trouble. We are the answer to the cry for help. Our brother that was murdered in Minnesota a few days ago was rendering aid to 2 cops that got shot. Died very heroically. You guys heard Slick earlier? We're firefighters. We're like linebackers. We go where the fire is, and we make a difference or we die trying. We don't have a lot of Danny Woos that have been down hallways and at the highest levels of classrooms when they're not on fire. We need the intellectual prowess that an independent person can bring to us to help protect us. Because ultimately, we've said this from the beginning of this kind of really pivoting our attention and focus and bullseye right on this cancer battle is this is as much about the oath we took to be firefighters. We're solving this puzzle, leading the charges to an extent because it disproportionately impacts us, but it's also about the oath we took to protect the public. It's about taking on the chemical companies. We go wherever the fight is. And that trickles right down to my children and my, if it comes, grandchildren. That's the battle we're in, and we need to be together on it, period. So thank you for bringing what you bring to this dance, and we need, more doctors like Dr. Wu, lawyers like Rob Bilott, producers like Elijah Vedder, wives like Diane Carter that will not be silenced, mothers like Kathy Crosby Bell that will do whatever it takes and go wherever the fight is. Doctors like Erin Kolbitz, who's leading the charge. We all have to work together. And at the end of the day, how do they beat us? We die for strangers. What are you going to do? Can't kill us all, you know? Thank you.
Gentlemen, madam, thank you so much. Dr. Wu, yes?
One quick addition to this conversation is PFAS is a carcinogen. That's why we're here. And if that's not abundantly clear by now, then see me after the talk.
You don't want to see him after. You don't want to see him after.
Now, know this. Not only is it a carcinogen, but it's an immunotoxin, it's an organ toxicant, it's an endocrine disruptor, it's a teratogen, means that potentially your offspring may have birth defects because of it. It exhibits transplacental exposure, and it's found in maternal milk. So it's not just that it's a carcinogen, it's just the scientific term in fire speak for PFAS is methyl ethyl bad stuff.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking our panel today for their insights and their... Thank you very much. We will now continue on to